Welcome to The Volley, a podcast by tennis majors, bringing you in-depth insight into tennis's latest hot topics from the tennis majors team.
I'm Chris Oddo, and I'm very happy to welcome Simon Cambers to this latest edition of The Volley, the new podcast from Tennis Majors, which is the ultimate one-stop shop for all tennis fans, with all the latest video, news, features, debates, and everything you could want to keep you up to date with the tennis world. Today we're going to break down the Tokyo Olympics with Simon. The medals have been handed out, the tears of joy and sadness have been shed, and Simon is here to help us make sense of it all. For the first time in history due to the coronavirus pandemic, the Olympic tennis event was played without spectators in some of the most grueling, almost debilitating conditions. We'll talk about how these unique conditions shaped the games. We'll be discussing the performances of tennis luminaries Novak Djokovic and Naomi Osaka, as well as the gold medal performances of Alexander Zverev and Belinda Bencic, along with the many inspiring and surprising results that occurred during the tournament, all the way through to the medal rounds. So a warm welcome to Simon Cambers. Simon has been a freelance writer specializing in tennis since 2002, working for numerous publications including The Guardian, London Times, Reuters, ESPN.com, and, most recently, Tennis Majors. He's also the current co-president of the International Tennis Writers Association. It's a great pleasure to speak with you, and looking forward to talking some Olympics tennis with you. How are you today?
I'm very well, thanks. Yeah, it's been an interesting few weeks.
Yeah, quite a whirlwind week of tennis in Tokyo. I think if we turn back the clock maybe 10 days ago, we were concerned about a lot of the elements of this tournament. I mean, the fact that it was being held in the thrust of a raging pandemic, the fact that there would be no spectators in attendance, the fact that we were missing a lot of the top names, particularly on the men's side, like Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal. Some people were once again wondering if Olympic tennis was even relevant at all. So I ask you, Simon, now that the tournament has come and gone, the medals have been handed out, what did we learn about that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I was thinking about this the other day when I was listening to, bizarrely, the coverage of the golf, the Olympic golf, which is a much younger sport in terms of how long it's been back in the Olympic fold, and that seems to be taking off amongst players. Players who play it are realising what it means to them, and you see from the reactions of the players in the tennis who lost important matches, it meant everything. And once you get to the Olympics, I think that's when you realise what it is, what that kind of event is, because it's not just about the tennis, it's about all the other nations that come together, all the sports that come together. So for tennis players who are sort of generally used to doing their own thing and going about things in their own way, being a little bit selfish in a way, it's great for them to play in a team environment, even if they're still playing for themselves on the court in singles. But to be joined with team members and play a proper event over a week, I think everyone who plays it realises that it's a really big deal. And it's been really interesting looking at the reaction of people like Brad Gilbert, who thinks that for him the Olympics is as good, as big, on the same level as a Grand Slam. And I'm sure if you asked Belinda Bencic and Alexander Zverev, I think they would say the same thing right now.
Yeah. In fact, they already have. Zverev, the gold medal men's singles, and Bencic, the gold medal women's singles, had a lot of great things to say about the games, as have many other players that we've heard throughout the last 10 days in Tokyo. In spite of the almost unbearable heat and the difficult conditions, and the lack of the star power and the fact that there weren't any spectators, it's almost like, and correct me if I'm wrong, Simon, it seems like the players don't either remember or recognize just how special it's going to be until they show up in the Olympic Village and start to take part in these games.
Yeah, that's it. It's when they get the whole Olympic experience that it really hits home. I think, it's exactly what I was just saying. I think when tennis players go week to week from tournament to tournament, they're amongst themselves. They get in this sort of bubble almost, even before a pandemic bubble. They're in their own world. And so to step outside that and to see other people who are equally good at their sports, maybe even better, and to sort of get a taste of life beyond tennis is a big deal for them. And I think when you think back to when you look at the players who were not there, we talk about the lack of star power with no Nadal, no Federer, no Halep, and some of the other big names missing on the women's side, no Serena Williams. Yes, that's a shame. But there are reasons for all those, and they're not just because they didn't fancy playing the Olympics. I mean, Halep would have bitten your left arm off if she could have played the Olympics, but she wasn't ready. For someone like Serena Williams and Roger Federer, they're at the end of their careers, and they don't know how much more tennis they've got left in them, and so to risk an Olympics was not worth it for them. And for Nadal, similar state of affairs. He wants to be back playing 100%. If he's not 100%, it's not worth it. He has won the Olympic gold before, so it's not like they're sort of saying the Olympics is not worth it. It's just that they're at different stages of their careers. So I think when you look at the reasons for people not playing, you have to really look in a bit more depth, other than the fact that they're just saying, "Oh, I don't want to play the Olympics." But yeah, I think it's been a fascinating Olympic Games. Really, it's been a long time coming in many ways, isn't it? 5 years from Rio, and as you said, Chris, I think when we last spoke in the podcast, Rio Olympics was an incredible event, and in many ways, Tokyo will go down as an equally incredible event. I mean, there are some big shocks, some really big talking points, some big wins for players, some amazing moments, and a lot of moments that will stick in the memory of players for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, most certainly. And before we move on and talk about a few of those shocking and exciting and inspiring moments, I wanted to ask, have we decided officially that the Olympics are relevant for tennis and that it is necessary and it is a good relationship? And some of the names that you mentioned that missed for certain reasons, do you think they do a disservice for the sport by not showing up for the Olympic Games and by not making it as big, as much of a blowout event as it potentially could be? Or does it not matter, as you were sort of alluding to?
Well, I think in an ideal world, yeah, it would obviously be much better if they were there. And I think that something that tennis has to look at in the future is something they've dabbled with over the last few Olympiads is, what to do about ranking points and prize money and all that sort of stuff. Because I think if there were ranking points in the Olympics for tennis players, then more people would play it. The Americans, who largely don't play on the men's side, the John Isners of this world, they would be more drawn to it. Now, that's not necessarily the best reason to play the Olympics, but if it's a reason to get all the best players playing, then I think that's a good thing. You can compare it to golf again. I know in golf they get ranking points, and tennis did have it before they took it away, because the reason being that it could be considered unfair because the field is so small. But it is interesting. I was reading a story on Around the Rings by Sebastian Fest, who's a very good journalist from Argentina, a long-standing tennis journalist, and he had a chat with Dave Haggerty, the ITF president, and it seems like they want to make tennis an 11-day event in Paris and beyond. And if they do that, then they could increase the field, perhaps. And if they do that, then there's less of a reason not to award ranking points. And, I think that would be a way to get a lot of the better players there.
In a recent piece for tennismajors.com, you made the link between history, politics, and the Olympics, pointing out that 13 players from former communist countries in Eastern Europe have earned a place on the singles podium. Of course, there's Kafelnikov and Dementieva, who both won singles gold. I wonder if you could take a moment to elaborate further on that piece, what inspired you to write it, and in general, did you see that trend continue at Tokyo?
Yeah, it's a subject that I've noticed, well, right back to when Kafelnikov won in Sydney, and that was Dementieva. I think she won the silver that year. That's when Dementieva said to me, the Olympics means so much for people in Russia. General, normal, everyday people in the street will tell you who won an Olympic medal. They'd have a much better chance of telling you who won the Olympic tennis medal than they would who won the French Open, which is, it just sort of shows you the status that Olympics has. And it goes back to politics and history, and it's when in the Cold War, when sport was a status symbol for communist countries who, they couldn't really hold up too many things as being better than the West, but if they could be better at sport, that was something they thought they could do, and they were for a long time. The GDR, the East Germans, yes, with the help of a systematic doping regime, but they beat the Americans and they beat the West, and it meant a great deal to their governments, at least. Whether or not it meant a great deal to the people individually, I don't know, but it was certainly held up as a status symbol in the country, and it's something that stayed with the players from those countries ever since, even the ones who are from countries that are no longer communist governments. I mean, I think if you look at, all of Eastern Europe, really, the Czechs, look at Krejcikova and Siniakova winning the title. Look what it meant to them. The sort of history they have in the sport. I think all of the Eastern European countries hold the Olympics perhaps in more of a status than the Western countries, which is amazing given what the Olympics has become. But yeah, certainly it stemmed from when Dementieva told me that, and I know Kafelnikov. I remember I was actually in Sydney in 2000, living and working there for a year, covering the Olympics, and I knew Kafelnikov was going to win it. I can't tell you why, but it was partly because of that. The Russians, especially the Russians, just try so hard in the Olympics, and they peak for it because they know what it means to everybody, to themselves and to everybody back at home. And when you look at Alexander Zverev winning, yes, he's German, but look at his history. Look at his pedigree and his genetics. He's got Russian parents. They both were professional tennis players. In their side of the family, both of them are steeped in Olympic tradition. So it's no surprise to see someone like him trying to peak right at the right time, and as he showed, winning the title, getting it right.
It's an interesting prism to view Olympic tennis through. It's just stamped into the psyche of certain players, and you could hear it when they talk about the Olympics, even in non-Olympic years. And I guess if you look at this year's tournament, we had men's doubles final, which was all Croatian. We saw the Czechs, as you mentioned, take women's doubles. We saw an all-Russian mixed final. So clearly you're onto something with this, Simon.
Yeah, it's remarkable, isn't it? It's not just the ex-communist countries. It's also the countries for whom the Olympics in history mean a lot more. So the Australians, the Brits, not so much the Americans, even though the Americans obviously have a phenomenal record in the Olympics across many sports. I think more for like the Greeks, the original, the French, the ones who were in the first few Olympics and doing well. I know. We know, don't we, from working for tennis majors with so many of our French colleagues, we know what the Fed Cup and the Davis Cup means to France. And the same goes for the Olympics. The French players were trying everything they could. I think there's a lot of history involved in it. It's harder for newer countries, even though, you want to make your mark for a new country and you want to try to sort of, I don't know, make have your best days. But when it means so much to the country, I think then playing for that country, and the Olympics is a big chance to do that. It just means that little bit more.
You talked earlier about blowout moments that we saw at these Olympic Games. Off the top of your head, what would be the number one true, blowout storyline of the Tokyo Olympics in tennis?
I think it has to be Djokovic losing. I mean, I know he lost to Alexander Zverev, who's world number 5 or whatever he is now, but and in theory, that could happen any week. But it seemed, especially given the way that Djokovic had annihilated Nishikori, who another one I thought would do well in the previous round. I just thought Djokovic was nailed on, but it just shows you what it was that stopped Djokovic playing his best. Maybe he was exhausted. Maybe it was the pressure. Maybe he was, he said he was carrying a couple of injuries towards the end. It's just never easy to pick how someone is feeling. And I just think, he'd won the 3 Grand Slams leading in. He was a huge favourite on his best surface. It seemed like everything was playing into his hands. But to see him lose, also in the manner he did, where he just drifted away, which is very unusual for Djokovic. You would expect him to really... And he did keep fighting, but he didn't ever look like coming back. And that's something you can't really often say about him.
For our listeners, if you go over to tennismajors.com, you'll see a piece by Sasha Osmo, who's got a lot of interesting quotes from Novak Djokovic in the aftermath of those difficult days in Tokyo, where he didn't just lose in singles, he also lost the bronze medal match, and he also didn't medal in mixed doubles, which he had a shot to do as he was a semifinalist. So, I mean, in your opinion, was it fatigue? What do you think went wrong with Novak on this quest? Is it just the Golden Slam is just a thing that is maybe just too much to ask at this point in time?
I mean, it is a phenomenally difficult thing to do, isn't it? You can see that just in history, in historic terms, by the fact that Steffi Graf is the only person to do it. And when you look back at Graf, when she did it, she was 19, and she actually finished it by winning in Seoul. So she'd won the 4 Grand Slams. All the pressure was off. Even if she didn't win the Olympics, no one really would have cared, especially at that time when tennis was really only just coming back into the fold, and they needed to re-establish themselves. I think for Djokovic, it's really hard to tell. I'm sure there was some fatigue in there. It's been a very intense few months, hasn't it? From really the beginning of the clay court season all the way through to the end of Wimbledon. He barely stopped. I know he took a little bit of time in when he was sort of training for Paris and didn't play between Paris and Wimbledon, but there wasn't much time. He can't have had much time off. He's put an awful lot into this year. I don't think he, even by his standards, he didn't play his best at Wimbledon, but he still won. He did enough. He was good enough to win. Absolutely brilliant for him. But he wasn't sort of peaking. And I think, there's a lot of pressure, of course. And there just seemed to be a million people taking selfies with him at the Olympics. I don't know whether any of that drained him a little bit. It's really hard to tell. You can sort of second guess a lot of these things and probably get them wrong. I mean, I think you're right. In the end, it's just an incredibly difficult thing to do. And he still goes to the US Open with a chance to win the calendar year Grand Slam, the first man to do that since Rod Laver in 1969. And so few people have ever been in anywhere near this position. I mean, I think he's the first in this position since Laver won it. So that just shows you how difficult even the calendar year slam's been, let alone the Golden Slam. And then you just sort of factor in the fact that people, as we said, so some people are just absolutely desperate to perform their best at the Olympics. And Zverev, has to be said, played incredible tennis all the way through.
With Djokovic in mind, how do you think these losses will sort of play out in terms of his quest for the calendar slam, which is still very much on in New York? Do you think it hurts him at all?
I don't. It's, again, very hard to tell. I don't know how much he's going to play in the run-up to the US Open. I would imagine not that much, maybe one of the 2 Masters thousands. He has no obligations to do that anymore. He meets all the criteria to take one of them off at least. I think he's going to be pretty tired. I think a lot of it will depend on his draw. I was thinking the other day, imagine if he's got like a Kyrgios in the second round or something, and then somebody else, a Hashanov or somebody who will extend him in the early rounds. I think he could end up finding it very tiring and stressful. And we saw the stress coming out in him, didn't we, with his sort of hurling that racket into the stands and then bashing the racket into the net. And, we understand heat of the moment things, but they're very sort of, they're things that not that many players do. A lot of players bash their racket up occasionally, but not many hurl them into the stands. It's a pretty unusual thing. I know there was no one there, but the poor lineswoman had to duck, or she felt she had to duck. So it's an odd situation, and I can see him being pretty stressed as the US Open goes on. And when we think back to what happened last year, when he got defaulted, anything's possible. He's still the favourite, no question. But I've got a feeling, it was really interesting seeing pictures of Nadal training and practicing during the Olympics, getting back onto the hard courts and stuff. Nadal's on a mission, isn't he? He really does want to win that US Open, and it's interesting that over the last decade, which is even that's funny to say given the longevity of their careers, but over the last 7 or 8 years perhaps, Nadal's become more of a threat at the US Open than he is on any other hard court surface or event. So I can see Nadal really having a big role to say in what happens in New York. It's going to be difficult for Djokovic, but of course he's capable.
That's a very interesting point you make about Nadal maybe being more relaxed and having better preparation for the US Open. Novak, I got the feeling after Wimbledon that he wasn't completely sold on playing the Olympics with the calendar slam in mind. At least that was my interpretation, and maybe it was yours too. And I think he made a tremendous sacrifice for the country of Serbia to go play and to take part in those games. And he made it so special and he gave it such a good effort. But in the end, we're left wondering, maybe Nadal had the much better route in terms of, I mean, he won the U.S. Open the last time he played there, and he's kind of doing this preparation on his terms. And that's one of the things we talked about. There's an article up at tennismajors.com that I just put up, which is about the 10 things that happened while you were watching the Olympics, is that tennis didn't stop. The City Open is playing. There were tournaments going on, and a lot of things have happened in the last 2 weeks away from these Olympic courts. And maybe you've just hit on one of the most important things, which is that Nadal is once again getting healthy and ready to probably be definitely be the main competitor for Djokovic when it comes to the U.S. Open.
Without doubt, he's his biggest rival. And I think he will have taken a bit of encouragement from what happened to Djokovic at the Olympics, seeing him lose for a start to a rival, that he's not unbeatable, and also seeing that he was fatigued. And Djokovic, you're absolutely right. He definitely put it all on the line for his country, for Serbia, and he played mixed doubles too, didn't he? And maybe that was an issue. Maybe he shouldn't have done that, but obviously he felt like he should. It's going to be really interesting US Open. I mean, looking forward to that already with Nadal getting set. And I think you're right. If he's 100% fit, then he is absolutely the biggest threat to Djokovic winning the calendar year Grand Slam.
And if we switch over to another topic, Olympics related, the performance of Naomi Osaka, I'd love to hear your take on that. She was lighting the cauldron prior to the start of the games. She was literally the face of the games, certainly the face of the tennis, maybe the face of the whole Olympic Games. How did it work out for her? How did she perform in the end as you look back on what happened?
Well, it's a strange one, isn't it? Because the first 2 rounds, I thought she looked very good. She did very well, and I was thinking, wow, she's really dealing with everything in an impressive way. And then suddenly the wheels came off, and she was beaten very quickly. And you asked what the big moment or the biggest moments of the Olympics were. Then certainly her losing in that 3rd round, in the manner she did, was a real shock. I think the pressure on her was enormous. You can talk about lack of crowds helping, but I don't think that's really. Don't think it really helped her this time because of she being the face of the games, being at home in Japan, desperately wanting to do well, but coming into it, on the back of, surely the worst preparation anyone could have imagined in terms of not playing and struggling with mental health and struggling with alerting the world to that and getting to grips with people's reaction to that and having people question whether she really was struggling. And, a lot of people misunderstand mental health and equate it with just mental strength, which is just not the right thing, of course. But she has to deal with a lot of that kind of reaction. I think lighting the flame must have been an incredible moment. Once she was not on that schedule for the next day, I had a feeling it was pretty clear that she was going to be involved somehow, and doing the flame was a great sort of Kathy Freeman moment for her. But, because of the preparation that she had coming into the Olympics, I think it was asking an awful lot to think that she was going to go on and win. As I said, in the first 2 rounds, I thought she looked pretty good, but the wheels came off pretty quickly when things started going wrong.
I think you're completely correct about that. The worst possible preparation for maybe the biggest tournament of her life, with all the issues that have gone on. But I wonder, it seems like if there is one success for Naomi, well, first of all, she got back on the court and got a few wins. That in and of itself is great. But I think she has pushed the ball forward in terms of mental health. I saw Nike run an ad that in support of athletes' mental health. Simone Biles took the torch from Naomi and expressed herself in a very eloquent manner and has really shed a lot of light on this situation in a very short time. I think Naomi has done a lot of good work in that regard. What is your take on that, Simon?
Yeah, I think Naomi will be very thankful for the way that Simone Biles has expressed what's happening in her life. And I think it sort of goes back to what happened with Naomi Osaka at the French Open. I think a lot of people would have completely understood a lot easier and quicker what was happening with her if she'd been able to sit there the same way Simone did in her press conference at the Olympics and talk about the struggles she's had. But, not everyone can deal with these things in the same way. So it's fair enough in many ways. But I think that, she's opened the door for everyone to feel better about expressing the problems they're having in life and around their job, which is in this case is playing sport, playing tennis. So hopefully that will help her and help her to deal with it. I think it's a good thing that she got back on court. It was, if she'd not played the Olympics, the sort of with every tournament that you don't play in a situation like this, the more stress there is the time you come back, because people are going to be asking so many questions about it. And I can imagine at the US Open, what it's going to be like for Naomi Osaka, and she'll be defending champion there too. So there is a lot of stress there, and it'll be interesting to see, when and where she comes back and how often she plays and what she does from here on. But I think, just opening the door to talking about mental health issues is a very good service to a lot of athletes who, as the Olympics are showing, are affected by mental health issues, because playing sport at an elite level is not an easy thing to do. There's, everybody is human, and in all walks of life, we all suffer from different levels of mental health issues. And Naomi's obviously had a pretty rough time of it over the last couple of years, but she should, I hope, benefit from talking about it and from it being more out there and more understood in the general public.
She's an impressive young woman, and I think that will be part of her legacy, along with the impressive mind-bending tennis that she plays. Speaking of some success stories at the Olympics, Alexander Zverev, we hit on him, won 22 of his final 27 games in singles. I mean, is this the beginning of something special for Zverev? We've talked about Olympics as a springboard moment for some athletes, how it can be, how it was for Andy Murray, maybe even a Lindsay Davenport. Do you think this is the beginning of something bigger, or is this an end-all moment for Zverev?
Yeah, it could be the beginning of big moments for Zverev. Yeah, it's very similar to Andy Murray in many ways. Murray lost in 4 finals of Grand Slams before winning at Wimbledon in the Olympics in 2012, and that was absolutely the catalyst for him to go on and achieve what he achieved with 3 Grand Slams and number 1 and Davis Cup and many, many more things. Zverev certainly looked like he reveled in the conditions and the situation. He played brilliantly. He's had to deal with, or he's been the subject of a lot of controversy in terms of allegations against him in his private life, which he has to answer. But in pure tennis terms, on the tennis court, it could be a moment where he kicks on from here, and he's going to be a big threat at the US Open, where of course he got to the final last year. It's amazing what the Olympics can do. I mean, your piece covered all this, didn't it? The springboard effect it can have for a lot of players, Lindsay Davenport being another. It just gives you that confidence. There's no question his confidence is going to be absolutely sky high going to New York. He didn't have any problems with his serve. He served out of a tree most of the time, and he blew Djokovic off the court towards the end. So yeah, he's in a great position. He will be feeling very, very good about his tennis right now.
Yeah, I think what we talked about earlier is how some of these athletes view the Olympics as the most important tournament in the world. Therefore, if I can win the most important tournament in the world, why can't I go on and kick on and win a Grand Slam, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people will pick holes in that kind of discussion in terms of, it's only best of 3 sets and maybe Novak would have come back. But I doubt it, given how exhausted Novak was. But you only play the conditions that are in front of you. He did exactly what he needed to do to win it. I think he's got everything he needs to win a Grand Slam, no question. And I don't even know if Dominic Thiem's going to be in the US Open field at this stage. Even if he is, he's not going to be at the level he was last year. So you're really only looking at Djokovic and Nadal and maybe Tsitsipas and Medvedev, who are sort of really big rivals for Zverev. And with that confidence, absolutely, he will believe he's won the biggest tournament in the world. He can go on and win the US Open. And just in terms of pressure, there won't be the pressure that has been on him in the past, because he's forever an Olympic champion.
If we talk about the women's side, Belinda Bencic wins the gold medal. Quite a surprise, really. I mean, Ash Barty's the top seed, the reigning Wimbledon champ. Naomi Osaka, as we talked about, is the face of the games. A lot of other top players having in the midst of great seasons in this tournament, and yet it's Belinda Bencic who comes away with gold in singles, silver in doubles. Can you explain that?
Well, actually, I'm thinking when you asked me off the top of my head the big moments in the tournament. Of course, I forgot Barty losing. That was a massive one. Because she again had looked very good early on. And then to go out the way she did was a real shock. I'm really delighted for Belinda Bencic. I think she's a really lovely person, really great to talk to, always nice and interesting. Like asks after you as much as just talking about her life and her tennis. And I've always enjoyed her game style, the way she takes the ball early, she redirects the ball all over the place, very sort of Martina Hingis-like, of course, because of the link with Hingis's mother, who was Bencic's coach, Melanie Molitor. But it's a big surprise, no question. When Osaka went, Barty went, Kvitova went early. The conditions were brutal, weren't they? Those first 3-4 days, especially, and especially when they were playing in the real brutal sun right above them, heat of the day. So it sort of created the opportunity for upsets, but I don't think too many people would have expected Barty to lose when she did. In the manner that she did, so because she'd looked so good at Wimbledon in particular, but yeah, it was a big surprise for Bencic. But she's always been capable of big things.
Along the same lines, the special moments at the Olympics, emotions that come to mind, the Brazilians winning bronze in doubles comes to my mind. Rublev and Pavlyuchenkova in mixed was fun for me. What are some of the moments that really struck you, Simon?
Yeah, I really enjoyed the mixed doubles with Pavlyuchenko and Rublev. I mean, they didn't, but they almost couldn't believe they got through the semis. I think when they saved a match point in the semis, and then in the final when they won it and saved a match point then. And also, I loved the Pavlyuchenkova pretending to put the second medal over her head instead of Rublev. That was brilliant. Yeah, some really interesting moments. And again, you talk about the Brazilians winning the bronze. I mean, that's something that no one would have predicted. I dare say there are a lot of people who love tennis who'd never heard of them. So, you get into the tournament like that and then you play the tournament of your life. I think that's a fantastic story. A great story again for Krejcikova, just going from strength to strength in the women's doubles with Siniakova. I mean, they're a great pair anyway, but just what she's done over the last few months is pretty remarkable. And also, just when you look at the finals, I think with the way Bencic sort of held her nerve towards the end of that final was very impressive, because she could really have disappeared and sort of made a lot of mistakes at times. But I think she showed that she has a big match mentality, and against Marketa Vondrousova, who had a fantastic tournament. Let's not forget, of course, beating Osaka along the way. I think she's another one. This will probably, the chances are this will be the biggest moment of her career. It's still an outside bet that she wins a Grand Slam, I would say, but she will forever have the Olympics. So just from her side, I think it's been a great Olympics.
On the flip side, one of the moments on the more sad side that struck me was Iga Swiatek losing to Paula Badosa in the second round and just bawling for almost a minute or two on court after that. If you didn't believe that the Olympics meant a lot, Olympic tennis meant a lot to some of these athletes, there was your indication.
I mean, it's so true that the players who went out, you talk about Iga Swiatek losing and then crying. I mean, look at Paula Badosa in terms of when she had to quit through injury. She was wheeled off the court. I mean, it's hideous looking at these moments. And tennis, in some ways, is lucky compared to other sports in the sense that, you watch some of these poor events, especially in the athletics, for example, track and field. And a guy full starts in his first heat. That's it, and he's worked for 4 years. Tennis does have a little bit more chance to get yourself into a match or into a tournament. But yeah, I mean, these players have, especially the likes of Swiatek, who talked a lot about the Olympics, and she has that Olympic heritage too. Looking at her family and the way sport is perceived in Poland. I think for a lot of people, a lot of sports people in tennis and outside tennis, the Olympics is the biggest is still the biggest thing. It's not the amateur sporting event that it used to be, but that's a long, long time in the past. It's the showpiece highlight of a sports person's career. And when you lose in a time when you thought you had a chance to maybe win a medal for your country, I think you're going to be pretty upset, and we saw that a lot.
And finally, Simon, so we came in with expectations, knowing that this was going to be a very bizarre Olympic Games, and it was in many ways. But in conclusion, I'd like to ask, did it once again surpass your expectations? And what are your final thoughts on these tennis games at the Tokyo Olympics?
I think it did pass my expectations, because, I mean, I've covered tennis for a long time now, and you can get a little bit blasé about these things, and you think, tennis in the Olympics, well, doesn't matter that much. Players won't be that invested in it emotionally. They'll just go through the motions. And then you get there and you see what happens with some of these matches, and as it goes on, and what it means to the players. I mean, I think tennis deserves its place in the Olympics. It has a historic place from back in the day, before, in the early 20th century. It was there absolutely alongside all the other sports. It was only when it was deemed to be sort of professional under the table that it was kicked out. But it's back in alongside every other sport, which is just as professional as tennis. And I think for a lot of players, especially the ones who are in the first half of their careers or middle of their careers, it's the biggest deal.
You've kind of triggered by your last response, Simon. I wanted to ask you if you had a feel for the general sports fan, the fan that's casually watching the Olympics, and if tennis has made an impression on them. And do you get a feeling that tennis being in the Olympics is doing the good work of broadening the profile of the sport worldwide, which would be a nice thing after all, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if people tuning into the Olympics without a specific sort of love of tennis would necessarily see the tennis and then stick with it, because it's something that you see more often than not anyway. If you're a normal sports fan, you might come across tennis week in, week out. If you're a general sports fan, you don't see archery on TV very often. You don't see water polo or sailing or other sports that are, still competed in at an absolutely incredible level, but just don't have the kind of publicity that tennis has. So I'm not sure it does that. I think when you've got to remember that the ITF, the International Tennis Federation, put a lot of money into grassroots tennis around the world in terms of their Grand Slam Player Development Fund, which gives money to countries who don't have, the money and the expertise that, say, the Grand Slam nations have, for example, the ones who just don't have the resources to fund tournaments and things. So you'll see a lot of players on the tour, big names too, like Victoria Azarenka, for example, who received help from the ITF's Grand Slam Development Fund in early days. And although that's not specifically linked to the Olympics, it's the ITF relationship with grassroots tennis that the Olympics also feeds. So there is certainly a crossover there. I don't know if a general regular sports fan would stick with tennis in the Olympics or really sort of get captivated by it. I think probably not. But that doesn't mean it doesn't deserve its place in the Olympics.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Volley Podcast. You can listen to all episodes of the Volley at tennismajors.com, on Spotify, and at all your favorite audio platforms.